This is from the second book of the series, Awakening on Main Street. Chapter 1, Back to the World. The morning shift at Blue Mountain Coffee began like any other, except that Joe Martinez knew it wasn't. 3 months had passed since the stranger's departure, 3 months since that extraordinary week when consciousness itself seemed to awaken throughout the city. Now, in the pre-dawn darkness of the cafe, Joe moved through his opening routine with the same practice efficiency he had developed over 5 years of service. Yet everything felt different. His hands knew the weight of each portafilter and resistance of perfectly tamped grounds and precise timing of extraction, but now these mechanical movements carried something else, a quality of attention that transformed routine into ritual. He unlocked the front door at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before official opening, just as he always had. The familiar scent of yesterday's coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the fresh grounds he'd begun preparing. Through the windows, streetlights still dominated the urban landscape, though the eastern horizon showed the first pale suggestions of dawn. The city was in that liminal space between night and day, between sleeping and waking, and Joe found himself thinking of the stranger's words about consciousness existing in similar thresholds. The espresso machine hissed to life with its usual morning protest, steam escaping from the joints that needed tightening, pressure gauges trembling toward optimal zones. Joe had maintained this machine for 3 years, knew every quirk of its temperament, every sign of its moods, but now, placing his palm against its warming steel surface, he felt something he couldn't quite name. A recognition, perhaps, of the machine as a partner in service rather than merely a tool. They were collaborators in the morning's first act of creation. His phone buzzed with a message from his mother. "Mio, don't forget Sunday's dinner. Your father wants to talk again about the restaurant." Joe set the phone aside without responding. The family restaurant, his expected inheritance, his presumed future, felt like a weight that he wasn't ready to examine. Since the awakening, since learning what conscious service actually meant, the thought of returning to his family business filled him with a peculiar dread. Not because he was above it, but because he feared he wasn't enough for it. The first customer arrived at 6:03 a.m., Margaret Shen, a night shift nurse from the hospital 3 blocks away. She'd been coming here for 2 years, always ordering the same dark roast coffee with 2 sugars, no cream. Joe had her cup ready before she reached the counter, but this morning something made him pause before completing the transaction. "Long night?" he asked, really looking at her for perhaps the first time. Her scrubs were wrinkled, her eyes shadowed with a particular exhaustion that came from witnessing too much human suffering in too short a time. Margaret seemed surprised by the question, by the quality of attention behind it. "Lost one tonight," she said quietly. 17-year-old, motorcycle accident. Joe's hand found the ceramic cup he had reserved for special occasions, one he had purchased after the stranger's visit, handmade with a subtle spiral pattern in the glaze that caught the light just so. He poured her coffee into it instead of the usual paper cup. "This one's on the house," he said, sliding it across the counter, "and the cup is yours to keep. Sometimes we need something solid to hold on to." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she didn't let fall. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic, and Joe saw her shoulders drop slightly, some invisible burden momentarily lightened. "Thank you," she whispered. And he knew she meant for more than just the coffee. After she left, Joe stood alone in the growing morning light, feeling the echo of what had just transpired. It was a small gesture of free coffee, a ceramic cup, yet he had felt something flow through the exchange, some quality of connection that transcended the simple transaction. This was what the stranger had meant by conscious service. Not grand gesture or mystical experiences, but full presence brought to ordinary moments. The morning rush began in earnest at 6:30 a.m., the familiar chaos of commuters seeking their chemical awakening. Joe had always prided himself on his efficiency during these periods. Muscle memory and systemic workflow allowing him to serve 40 customers in 20 minutes without breaking rhythm. But efficiency wasn't enough anymore. The awakening had shown him that each cup of coffee was an opportunity, each brief exchange a moment of potential connection. Yet as the line grew longer and the orders more complex, Joe felt his attention fragmenting. A businessman barked his order while scrolling through his emails. College student changed her mind 3 times about milk alternatives. The credit card reader jammed, requiring manual override. The milk steamer made an unhealthy grinding sound that suggested impending failure. In the midst of this familiar chaos, Joe felt his newly developed consciousness beginning to slip away, replaced by the old mechanical responses that had carried him through thousands of similar mornings. "Large cappuccino, extra dry," he called out, sliding the cup across the counter without looking at the customer who claimed it. "Medium latte, soy milk, extra shot." Another cup, another faceless transaction. The morning rush, well, it swallowed his intentions whole, reducing him once again to an efficient component in the machine of urban routine. It was then that Marcus arrived. Not the Marcus he'd served coffee for 3 years, but someone Joe barely recognized. The accountant who usually hunched over his laptop in the corner booth surrounded by spreadsheets and tax documents stood differently now. His shoulders were straight, his eyes clear, and present in a way that made Joe stop mid-motion, milk pitcher still in hand. "The usual?" Joe asked, though something in Marcus's expression suggested that nothing would be usual again. "Actually," Marcus said, his voice carrying a quality Joe hadn't heard before. In the stranger's words, in Lady Amara's teachings at the school in the shadows, he said, "I want to thank you." "Thank me?" "For what you've been doing here. Maybe you don't realize it, but something changed in how you serve coffee about 3 months ago. I noticed it first in small ways, how you'd remember not just my order, but my name. How the coffee started tasting like someone actually cared about making it, but it was more than that. Being served by someone fully present, even for 30 seconds while ordering coffee, it reminded me that I could be present too." Marcus pulled out a small notebook. In its pages were filled with observations and sketches. "I started paying attention because of you, to my breath while waiting in line, to the weight of the cup in my hands, to the taste beyond the caffeine hit. And that attention started spreading to other parts of my day, my work, my relationships, even my dreams. Everything became more vivid, more real." Joe felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of pride and fear he couldn't quite parse. I mean, just make coffee." "No," Marcus said with quiet certainty. "You serve souls. There's a difference." Before Joe could respond, Marcus had taken his usual table, but instead of immediately opening his laptop, he sat quietly, hands wrapped around his cup, steam rising like incense in the morning lights, streaming through the windows. He was simply being present, and his presence somehow made the entire cafe feel different, calmer, more spacious, as if the frenetic energy of the morning rush had found a still point around which to organize itself. The encounter with Marcus lingered in Joe's consciousness as the morning wore on. Each cup he prepared became an experiment in attention. Could he maintain presence while steaming milk? Could he feel the rightness of extraction, through the sound alone? Could he see each customer as Marcus had been seen? Not as an interruption or an obligation, but as an opportunity for genuine connection. The results were mixed. With some customers, the attempt at deeper attention seemed to create a subtle opening, a moment of real eye contact, a genuine smile, or brief exchange of what transcended transaction. But with others, his increased presence seemed to make them uncomfortable, as if being truly seen while ordering coffee violated some unspoken urban contract of mutual anonymity. Joe found himself navigating between these responses, learning to calibrate his attention to what each person could receive. Around 9 a.m. in the morning, rush subsided into the steadier rhythm of mid-morning. Elena Rodriguez entered the cafe. Joe hadn't seen her since their gathering at Grandfather Samuel's house 3 months ago, though he'd heard through Maya that she'd been deep in research, trying to understand scientifically what they'd all experienced during the awakening. Joe, she said, approaching the counter with an expression of barely contained excitement. I've been documenting everything, the patterns, the synchronicities, the consciousness shifts. It's all connected, and it's accelerating. She pulled out a tablet. Its screen was covered with graphs and charts that meant nothing to Joe, but clearly represented months of careful observation. Look at this, she said, pointing to an upward curve, reports of spontaneous awakening experiences. They're increasing exponentially, and they all seem to be centered around certain locations, certain practices, certain people who are serving as catalysts. Catalysts, Joe repeated, the word feeling heavy on his mouth. You're one of them, Elena said with scientific certainty. The cafe, your service, the quality of attention you bring to your work, it's creating ripples. Small ones maybe, but they're spreading. Marcus isn't the only one. I've interviewed 17 people who regularly come here, and all of them report some shift in consciousness over the past 3 months. Subtle for some, dramatic for others, but consistent. Joe set down the cup he'd been drying, his hands suddenly unsteady. I don't understand. I'm not trying to be a catalyst or teacher or whatever. I'm just trying to be present while I work, to bring actual attention to what I'm doing instead of going through the motions. That's exactly it, Elena said, leaning forward with the intensity of scientific discovery. It's not about trying to change others. It's about changing yourself so completely that others can help. They can't help but notice the difference. Consciousness is contagious, Joe. When someone truly awakens, even partially, it creates a field that affects everyone around them. She showed him another graph, one mapping what she called consciousness clusters throughout the city. Blue Mountain Coffee showed it as a small but distinct point of light connected by thin lines to other nodes. The park where Maya played her music, the community center where Leo taught construction, the comedy club where Tariq performed. Various locations where their expanded group gathered to practice what they'd learned. We're creating a network, Elena explained, not intentionally maybe, but it's happening. Each person who experiences a moment of real awakening becomes a potential node, and the network is growing. Joe studied the web of connections on her screen, seeing a small cafe as part of something vast and interconnected. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. What if I'm not ready for this? What if I'm not enough? Elena's expression softened from scientific excitement to human understanding. Well, that's what I thought whenever my research started revealing things that didn't fit any known paradigm. The imposter syndrome was crushing. But then I realized we're not supposed to be enough on our own. That's why we have each other. That's why the awakening is happening collectively, not just individually. She ordered her usual cortado with oat milk, but this time Joe prepared it with the full knowledge of what his service might represent. Not just coffee, but connection. Not just transaction, but transmission of something subtle yet significant. As he handed her the cup, their fingers briefly touched, and he felt it again, that current of connection the stranger had spoken about, the recognition of consciousness meeting itself in another form. After Elena left, the cafe entered its quiet period between morning rush and lunch crowd. Joe used the time to clean, but cleaning had become something different since the awakening. Each surface he wiped, each tool he maintained, each adjustment he made to the space became an act of preparation, not just for the next customer, but for the next opportunity to serve consciously. He thought about his family's restaurant, about his father's disappointment that Joe had chosen to work for strangers instead of continuing the family business. You have gifts, mijo, his father would say, but you waste them making coffee for people who don't even know your name. The irony was that Joe had learned more about true service in his corporate coffee shop than he'd ever understood in his family's restaurant, where service had always been tangled with obligation, tradition, and unexpressed resentments. The stranger had asked him once, "What serves the awakening consciousness?" At the time, Joe hadn't understood the question. Now he was beginning to see that everything could serve consciousness if approached with the right quality of attention. But knowing this intellectually and living it moment by moment were vastly different challenges. The lunch crowd brought new tests of his developing awareness. A mother with 3 young children, all of them crying or whining, needing patience he wasn't sure he possessed. A businessman who complained that his espresso was too bitter, though Joe knew the extraction had been perfect. The teenager who spilled an entire iced latte requiring 15 minutes of mopping while other customers waited. Each situation demanded presence, equanimity, and ability to serve without losing himself in reaction or resentment. By 2 p.m., Joe was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The effort of maintaining consciousness while serving dozens of people, each with their own needs and energies, had drained something essential from him. He found himself in the back room, sitting on a milk crate, head in his hands, wondering if the old mechanical way hadn't been easier. At least when he'd been unconscious, he'd felt the weight of each failed moment of presence, each return to automatic behavior. "It's harder than they told us it would be," a voice said from the doorway. Joe looked up to see Leo Thompson, still in his construction work clothes, plaster dust in his hair and on his boots. They'd barely spoken since the gatherings 3 months ago, but each absorbed in their own integration process. "Leo," Joe said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "Same thing as you, I think. Trying to figure out how to stay awake while doing work that seems designed to put us to sleep." Leo grabbed another milk crate and sat down heavily. "I've been trying to bring consciousness to construction work. Do you know how hard it is to maintain presence while operating a jackhammer?" Despite his exhaustion, Joe laughed. "Probably about as hard as maintaining it while dealing with someone who wants a half-calf, sugar-free vanilla soy latte with exactly 3 ice cubes." "Well, the thing is," Leo continued, his voice thoughtful, "I keep remembering something the stranger said. He told me that conscious work isn't about the work itself, but about the quality of attention we can bring it. That any work can be sacred if approached with the right inner state, but maintaining that inner state while the external world does everything possible to disrupt it. It's like trying to meditate in the middle of a hurricane," Joe finished. "Exactly. But then sometimes there are these moments. Yesterday I was laying a brick and suddenly I could feel it, not just the weight and texture of each brick, but its history. The clay it came from, the fire that hardened it, the hands that touched it before mine. For maybe 30 seconds, I wasn't just building a wall, I was participating in something ancient and essential. Then my supervisor yelled at me for working too slowly and the moment shattered." Joe recognized the experience, those brief windows when ordinary work became extraordinary, when consciousness suddenly illuminated what had been mechanical. I had one of those moments this morning. A nurse came in after losing a patient. Gave her a ceramic cup instead of paper. And it didn't charge her for the coffee. It was a small thing, but something that passed between us. Like consciousness recognized itself through the simple act of serving and receiving coffee. Well, that's what we're supposed to be doing, isn't it? Leo asked. Creating these moments, these small openings where something real can happen. I think so, but I also think I'm failing more than I'm succeeding. Leo was quiet for a moment and then said, "The stranger told me something before he left. He said failure is just consciousness recognizing where more work is needed. That every moment we notice we've gone mechanical is actually a small awakening." They sat in companionable silence. Two men in a coffee shop back room, both carrying the weight and wonder of trying to stay conscious in an unconscious world. Outside, Joe could hear the afternoon customers arriving, the familiar sounds of commerce and caffeine seeking. But something had shifted in his exhaustion. The conversation with Leo had reminded him that he wasn't alone in his struggle, that throughout the city, others were engaged in the same impossible, essential work of bringing consciousness to ordinary life. "I should get back out there," Joe said, standing and stretching muscles stiff from the morning's work. "Yeah, I should get home, shower off this construction dust before meeting Maya for dinner." Leo stood as well, then paused at the doorway. "Hey, Joe, we should do this more often. Check in with each other. The stranger may be gone, but we're still here, still working on what he started. Or what he reminded us was always possible." "I'd like that," Joe said, and he meant it. The afternoon shift proceeded differently after Leo's visit. Joe found himself working with renewed patience, not because he'd suddenly mastered constant presence, but because he'd been reminded that the work itself, the trying, failing, and trying again, was the practice. Each return to mechanical behavior became an opportunity to wake up again. Each moment of genuine presence, however brief, was a small victory against the entropy of unconsciousness. Around 4 p.m., a familiar figure appeared in the doorway, Sarah Williams, who had been one of the night shift baristas when the stranger first appeared. She'd quit shortly after the awakening, saying that she needed time to process what happened. Joe hadn't seen her since. "Sarah," he said, genuinely pleased, "how are you?" She approached the counter slowly, as if uncertain of her welcome. "I've been processing. That's the only word for it. Everything that happened 3 months ago, it changed something fundamental in me. I couldn't keep working here. Couldn't keep pretending that serving coffee was just about serving coffee." "I know what you mean," Joe said. "But that's just it. You didn't quit. You stayed. And from what I've been hearing, you've been transforming this place. People talk about it, you know. The coffee shop's where something's different, where the barista actually sees you." Joe felt uncomfortable with the characterization, the weight of expectation it carried. "I just try to be present. Most of the time I fail." "But you keep trying, and that's what I came to tell you. I've been working with kids, teaching them music and movement, trying to help them stay connected to the natural consciousness they're born with before the world teaches them to go to sleep. And every day, I feel more than I succeed. I learned something from watching you before I left. The trying is the teaching. The effort itself, even when it fails, creates something. It shows others that a different way is possible." She ordered a simple green tea, and Joe prepared it with the same attention he would have brought to the most complex espresso drink. As he handed it to her, she said, "The stranger saw something in you, Joe. We all did. Don't let the weight of that make you forget to see it in yourself." After she left, Joe stood at the counter, watching the late afternoon sun slant through the windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny celebrations of light. He thought about consciousness, about service, about the mysterious way awareness could pass from one person to another through the simplest gestures. The stranger had planted seeds, but it was up to them to tend the garden. The evening shift manager arrived at 5 p.m., ready to take over, but Joe found himself reluctant to leave. The cafe had become something more than a workplace. It was a laboratory for consciousness, a place where he could practice the delicate art of staying awake while serving others. Each day brought new challenges, new failures, new moments of unexpected grace. "You okay to close up?" the manager asked, noting Joe's hesitation. "Yeah, just thinking," Joe replied, untying his apron slowly. As he prepared to leave, Joe noticed a young man sitting alone in the corner booth. Same booth Marcus had occupied that morning. The young man was drawing in a sketchbook, completely absorbed in his work, oblivious to the world around him. But there was something in his concentration, the quality of presence that Joe recognized. He was awake in his own way, conscious in his creation. Joe prepared a small espresso, one of the singles they usually used for training new baristas. He walked over to the young man's table and set it down gently beside the sketchbook. The artist looked up, surprised. "I didn't order." "It's on the house," Joe said, "for the work you're doing." The young man looked confused. "You don't even know what I'm drawing." "I don't need to. I can see how present you are with it. That's worth celebrating." Something passed through the artist's eyes, recognition perhaps, or the sudden awareness that he'd been seen not just as a customer, but as a fellow consciousness engaged in the work of staying awake. "Thank you," he said. And Joe heard in those two words an entire conversation about presence, art, and the mysterious ways consciousness supports itself. Walking home through the city streets, Joe felt the familiar weight of exhaustion, but also something different. A quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with accomplishment and everything to do with alignment. He hadn't mastered consciousness or perfected the art of service, but he had spent another day trying, failing, and trying again. And in that effort, small openings had been created, moments where awareness had passed between people like light through suddenly opened windows. His phone buzzed with another message from his mother about Sunday dinner, about his father's plans for the restaurant. Joe knew he'd have to face that conversation soon, would have to explain why he couldn't simply return to the family business as if nothing had changed. The awakening had shown him that conscious service wasn't about where you worked, but how you worked. And also, he knew that some environments made consciousness easier to maintain than others. But that was a challenge for another day. Tonight he would go home to his small apartment, sit in the silence he'd learned to appreciate since the stranger's departure, and feel the day settling into his bones. Tomorrow he would return to Blue Mountain Coffee and begin the impossible work of staying awake while serving others. It wasn't much, perhaps. Making coffee, paying attention, creating small moments of connection in the urban flow, but the stranger had shown them that consciousness didn't require grand gestures, only genuine presence brought to ordinary moments. As he climbed the stairs to his apartment, Joe remembered something else the stranger had said. Every cup of coffee is an opportunity to practice remembering who you really are. At the time, it had seemed like one of those mystical statements that sounded profound but meant nothing practical. Now, after 3 months of trying to live it, Joe was beginning to understand. The coffee was just the medium. The real work was consciousness itself, maintaining it, sharing it, helping others remember their own capacity for presence. The sun was setting as Joe reached his door, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere across town, Maya was probably playing her violin, creating spaces for consciousness through music. Elena analyzing her data, trying to map the unmappable patterns of awakening. Leo was perhaps looking at the structures he'd built during the day, seeing them metaphors for inner construction. Tariq might be preparing for an evening performance, finding ways to awaken others through laughter. They were all engaged in the same work, each in their own way, creating what Elena had called a network of consciousness through the city. It was happening quietly, without fanfare or recognition, through coffee and construction, music and comedy, research and art. The stranger had initiated something, but they were the ones who had to live it, day by day, moment by moment, failure by failure, and occasionally breakthrough by breakthrough. Joe entered his apartment, set down his keys, and stood for a moment in the doorway between his public life, private space. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice presence while serving coffee. His family would continue to pressure him about the restaurant. The world would continue its mechanical spinning, trying to lull everyone back to sleep. But tonight, in this moment, Joe Martinez knew who he was. Not just a barista, not just a disappointing son, not just another urban worker going through the motions. He was consciousness itself, temporarily focused in his particular form, learning to recognize itself in others through the simple act of serving coffee with presence. It wasn't enlightenment. It was the complete awakening the stranger had embodied, but it was real. And for now, that was enough. The city hummed outside his windows, millions of lives intersecting in patterns too complex to map, most of them asleep in their own deeper nature. But here and there, in coffee shops and construction sites, in parks and comedy clubs, in research labs and art studios, small lights of consciousness were flickering into existence, maintained by ordinary people doing ordinary work with extraordinary attention. Joe smiled, thinking of tomorrow's opening shift, of the pre-dawn ritual, of awakening the espresso machine, of the first customers seeing their morning coffee. Each cup would be an opportunity, each interaction a chance to practice presence. Most of the time he would fail, slip back into mechanical patterns, lose himself in the rush and routine. But occasionally, perhaps more often as he continued to practice, there would be moments of genuine awakening, his own and others, facilitated by nothing more than coffee served with consciousness. The work continued, the awakening, having been initiated, now had to be sustained through daily practice, through ordinary life lived with extraordinary attention. Joe Martinez, barista and reluctant catalyst, closed his door and prepared for an evening of rest before another day of impossible, essential work, staying awake in a sleeping world, one cup of coffee at a time.